Welcome, friends. I'm Angel Lily, and this is the Authentic Action Podcast Story Time. Today's story is one of my favorites. It's called The Parable of the Empty Boat. And I wanted to practice telling it to you today because it is one of the many parables that I am including in my upcoming book, The Shift, and I'm showing off some of my very simple graphic art here, which I intend to be putting into the book, and I'm keeping it nice and simple because it's a black and white print book. But I want to reestablish the practice of oral storytelling, even as I publish these written down stories. So, um, all that's to say that this story goes back a long way, and it is most often told orally as I'm about to tell it to you. And I am what I would call a baby multi-medium storyteller. I've been practicing, well, I'm 5 decades in, so perhaps I've been practicing all this time, and that might seem like a long time to you, but trust me, to become an elder, to become a true, proper storyteller, sometimes takes, well, perhaps it takes lifetimes. In my case, it takes more than 5 decades. That's all I know for sure. But I will continue to practice. And so I thank you for joining me today from wherever you are. And I encourage you to just take a deep breath. Maybe allow a smile to come over your face and sink into the present moment while I share this story with you. The parable of the empty boat is one of the parables that I'm including in my book, The Shift, my upcoming book, The Shift, which is about emotional regulation or dysregulation. And this parable fits nicely with that idea, which is why it's in the book and why I want to talk about it today. Because often we get disturbed and we blame it on the outside circumstances. Like, how could anyone be calm when there's a war going on outside? Or how could anyone be calm when, someone is nagging us or someone is criticizing us or someone needs our help or someone is screaming in pain and agony? There's all these outside external things, or perhaps there's internal things like, oh, I kind of got a pain here, or I get a crick in my neck, or my hands are very rough today. All of those things can pull me out of the present moment, pull me away from my calm, from my feeling whole and fulfilled in the present moment, and give me reason to feel dissatisfied, to blame or to shame someone else. This is a story that tries to highlight why that's a futile idea and why our own internal calm is really up to each of us, regardless of what's going on internally and externally. And that doesn't mean that we should hope to be perfect at it. It just means perhaps we can give ourselves and each other a little more grace for our imperfections. So the parable of the empty boat. I'm going to put my sunglasses on because it helps me drop into put my storyteller hat on in the form of some sunglasses. Not so long ago, in fact, practically just yesterday, there was a young monk, and he was living in a small town somewhere in the rolling hills of China. And he had gone to the small town in order to practice meditating, unfolding on his own spiritual journey, and in the hopes of acquiring a new level of inner peace and calm and fulfillment. So he went to the small town and he found himself a small little room and trade for some work, and he set about doing his chores every day, taking care of his work, and then meditating. And the first week he was found himself very distracted by, like, there was goats and chickens and all kinds of animal noises around the town that he wasn't used to. But he thought to himself, well, these are just sounds that I'm not used to, so I'll give myself a chance to get used to these different sounds. There's probably nothing really disturbing about them. And he continued to sit and practice his meditation. And day after day, he would do his chores and then sit down for his meditation. And every day, as he sat and meditated, his mind would notice disturbing things. And like one of the days, his neighbor came banging on his door to ask him if he wanted to visit, and he was like, "No, not right now. I'm trying to meditate. Can't you see?" And then he realized, well, that was silly because, of course, the neighbor was just being neighborly and he could not see because he was inside the house. So he started to go out onto the porch and light some incense and, you know, sit in his monk robe with his eyes closed up on his pillow in the lotus position, looking very, very meditative, so that people would be able to see that he was meditating and hopefully not disturb him. But what he found was, well, the goats and the chickens and the birds and the neighbor's cat did not care one bit that he was sitting there looking so calm and serene, or at least trying to. And the cat jumped on his lap, and the birds came and sang, and the neighbor's kids were outside playing ball, and he just kept being disturbed day after day after day. And every day it became like he was already pre-disturbed when he sat down. He was like, oh my goodness, I bet today that dang cat is gonna show back up. I bet today that bird is gonna sing again. And sure enough, the cat did show back up and the bird did sing and the children kept playing. And the monk progressively got more and more bothered and angry until a couple weeks after his arrival, he found himself just scowling all day while he was doing his chores, and then while he was sitting in his meditation. He was just really angry and couldn't seem to pull himself away from his angry thoughts. And the more he tried, the more that everything seemed to go wrong, and the wind picked up and knocked something over, and the chimes were rustling in the tree, and the cat came over again and meowed at him. And he got up suddenly in the middle of his meditation and said, "That's it. I've had enough. How can a monk be expected to meditate in all this noise with all this disturbance going on? I'm going to have to climb up to the top of the mountain and find a peaceful place so that I can meditate without all this disruption, all these disturbers coming around and disturbing me." So the monk gave up on meditating for that day and proceeded to pack himself up a little knapsack of food and a little bit of water and a little pillow so that he could make his way up to the lake at the top of the mountain that he'd heard about. And his plan was to go up there and basically just probably camp out, but he didn't have a tent or anything. He was just going to stay up there until he found some peace and quiet. So the next day, instead of getting to his chores, or after minimizing his chores, he set out on foot, and he was actually feeling pretty well because he was excited to be getting out of that town with all the chickens and goats and playing children and that dang cat that wouldn't leave him alone. And so as he walked along on the trail, he started to feel pretty enjoyable and or pretty joyful as he thought about how he was going to enjoy his meditation in the near future. And he walked along the trail and whistled a tune, and he heard some birds singing, and he whistled along with the birds. And he started to trudge his way up the steep hill, up the mountain, and all along the way he was pretty joyful, even though it was hard work, because he was knowing that he was on his way to the lake on top of the mountain, and there he was going to find nice and peace and quiet. And on the way, he passed a bird that was chirping and chirping. A couple of crows off to the side were squawking, and bird up in the tree was chirping and chirping, and he smiled to himself, thinking, ah, normally that might bother me, but today I know I'm on my way to the lake on top of the mountain, and so I'm not going to let that bother me because I know soon I will have my peace and quiet so I can meditate. And and he just whistled back at the birds and smiled at them, cawed back at the crows, and walked up on the trail along his way. And eventually he got to the lake on top of the mountain. And man, it was just beautiful. He sat down on the side of the lake and just took it all in, took a nice deep breath, exhaled. There were some mosquitoes flying about, and he shooed them away. And he looked around and noticed there was an empty boat off to the side of the lake. And so he decided he would get in the boat and paddle himself out into the middle of the boat where there was a little nice breeze and fewer bugs, hopefully, and just enjoy some meditation for the evening. And so that's what he did. The monk got in the boat and paddled himself into the middle of this little lake on top of the mountain. And it was so peaceful. And there were some birds singing, but they were off in the trees a little bit far away. And he was out in the middle of the lake, so there was certainly not going to be any neighbor's cat jumping on his lap. And there was no children laughing or playing. And he took a nice deep breath and exhaled a satisfying sigh and put the oars down in his boat and closed his eyes, took a nice deep breath, smelling the fresh air on top of the mountain, smiled as he began to relax. Finally, he was finding some peace and quiet, and he could meditate. And he started to feel that blissful feeling that comes with deep meditation as he was focusing on each chakra of his body and aligning each energetic center, doing a little bit of humming and chanting, feeling very free to just do whatever he wanted because there was no one and nothing around to disturb him. And soon he was in a deep meditative state, sitting cross-legged in the boat. And then he thought he heard a noise suddenly, a little bit of a splashing or a clunking noise. And so he looked up, and just as he looked up, he saw another boat. And that boat was coming right for him in the middle of the lake. And the monk suddenly stood up in his boat and shouted at the other boat, "Stop, you fool! You're coming right for me. Can't you see I'm out here where there's no one else? I've come to just find some peace and quiet." And just then, the boat banged right into the monk's boat in the middle of the lake. And the monk was almost thrown out of his boat and into the middle of the lake. And he fell into the bottom of his own boat. And he was very angry and came up ready to yell at the person in the other boat. But as he got up ready to yell at them, he realized that the other boat was completely empty. It was just an empty boat that had floated into the middle of the lake where he had let his own boat float because the current went to that part of the lake. And suddenly the monk realized how ridiculous it was that he was so angry at this other boat and almost to knock himself out of his own boat and certainly had knocked himself out of his own peaceful meditation by trying to blame someone else or make something or someone else responsible for his own inner peace. And he laughed and laughed and laughed in the middle of that lake in his boat with the other empty boat right next to his boat. And then he decided to take that boat back to the shore, and he tied the second boat to the back of his boat and rowed to the shore, slowly enjoying the row all the way, just giggling to himself, really realizing what a fool he had been. And once he was to the end of the lake, he tied up both boats and rolled up his knapsack and hiked back down the trail, whistling all the way along with the birds. When he got back to his own little room, he sat on the porch, and the cat came and sat on his lap, and he petted the cat as it purred, and he smiled as he listened to the neighbors' children laugh and play. And from then on, the monk never had to go anywhere else in order to find his own inner peace. All he had to do was imagine that lake at the top of the mountain and that empty boat and himself whistling as he walked back down to his own house from that boat on the lake on the mountain. Hmm. Well, I think I did not do a fantastic job of telling that story, and I'm going to have to keep practicing. But that is the end of the story. I'd love to know what you think of it. I imagine you might be able to retell it even better, and I welcome you to try. I think parables like this one are such an excellent way that we can convey a broader message. And this one might actually be true. There's no reason to think it's not a true story. But in general, parables don't need to be true to exemplify a truth. And that's the beautiful thing about them. One of my favorite parables is the story of Pinocchio, or the wooden puppet made by Geppetto, who wanted a son. And the reason that that's my favorite story about truth is because it's obviously not true. It's obviously made up about a wooden puppet that comes to life and his nose grows whenever he tells a lie. And in it allowing itself to explore the idea of truth and lie and becoming real and authentic by way of telling the truth, that story of Pinocchio is in a way more true than any true story that we might tell about truth. So I love stories and parables for this reason. I think they are an excellent tool for teaching. They are really perhaps the only tool that we still use for teaching when you really get down to it. And certainly for many thousands of years before human beings invented writing and the media, they were the way that we taught each other and our young about what we consider right and wrong and all those beautiful nuances of life. And so again, I thank you for joining me. I know this is rusty. I know it's a little bit clunky and bumpy. And all I can say is I'm here as my authentic self, willing to be imperfect and hoping that in doing that, I can encourage you to show up as your authentic self, willing to be imperfect. And I think if we all do that more of the time, that we'll all get better. That's my hypothesis. And I'd love to have you join me in testing out that theory. So I want to keep it short and sweet today. Again, remind you of my upcoming book, The Shift, where I talk about emotional regulation and why emotional fitness is a foundational key that we all need to master more so that we can navigate this very turbulent, shifty, shady, shadowy time that we're all in. So, um, mhm. Check out my company, the Sleeping Dragons Company, over on Etsy right now, or perhaps on my own website, depending on when you're listening to this, where I carry many essential oil blends and aromatherapy perfumes, phthalate-free fragrance oils, and many, many more items aimed at helping you awaken your own creative spirit. That's it for now. Don't forget to be excellent to yourself, and I will be seeing you soon. Ciao.